Hey, what's up, guys? All right, so I'm in my son's room, one of them. My other son is home on spring break, so he's been told to be quiet. We'll see how that goes. Anyway, what I want to talk about today, I'm going to keep this video as short as possible, which means I need to get to it. To begin with, I want to actually go over the business aspect, like stuff on the syllabus, because I tend to forget. I'm going to talk to you about Breihan. That's the sample secondary source on Coursed-In, which you are free to use, actually. Some people like to use that guy. I think the article is kind of fun. So if you haven't read it, you will need to here in a moment. Before that, though, I want to touch on what we have coming up. You have bibs due today. You should do that. You also have a revision of paper 2, which is optional. But if you choose to take that option, I think most of you should, that'll be due April 13th. So you got a bit of time on that. But again, the name of the game in that case is you need to sort of sit down, schedule out, all right, when am I working on paper 3? When am I really gonna spend some time on paper 2 and revising it? It's worth scheduling. I wouldn't just like play that one by ear. Anyway, yeah, Breihan. So I printed it out because that's how my brain works. You may not need to, but at the very least, I'd like you to pull it up. It is on Coursed-In. It is in the prompts section near the bottom. Tom Breihan, it's how I pronounce his name. I don't know if it's pronounced that way. Die Hard humanized and perfected the action movie. If you can go find that. Yeah. All right. So anyway, now that you found it, I hope, you have to read it. I assume most of you have not. If you have, well done. If not, though, go ahead and read over it. At the very least, review the thing, because we're going to talk about it. Primarily, what I'm concerned with today, I want to review this, what I would call foundational concept of when to quote. So go ahead and read it. We'll talk about it. All right. I hope you paused it, read it, whatever you had to do. You may not have, which is always fun for me, because I don't know. But, all right, when do we quote? We quote for language, not ideas. I say this on the heels of paper 2. I think some of you are starting to figure it out. Some of you are. Others, not so much. And that's a problem for multiple reasons, which I would charitably say belabored this semester, as I always do. But it really is like your paper, right, is built upon ideas, is built upon arguments. All of those start with your evidence. So if you don't have good evidence, or if you are not inclined to use your evidence properly, everything else suffers, okay? Everything else kind of falls apart. So quoting for language rather than ideas, what does that mean? I have some examples, conveniently enough, in the Breihan article. Let's start with the first paragraph. Actually, I guess I should overview it real quick. It's a really good article. It's short. Most popular sources, this is a popular source. It's from an online magazine. I forget which one right now. It's kind of fun. He curses. He makes a couple like sort of joke type things. He calls McLean a couple times an asshole, which is the beginning of the movie. We kind of covered. He is, right? So that, but it's a little easier to read, I imagine, than what maybe you guys have found on, say, Galileo, right? This is the sort of thing you can use in this paper. You do not have to. I recommend looking for popular sources, but also using Galileo. I think you both can be super helpful. With that in mind, though, as I was trying to say a moment ago before I did the preamble, let's look at quotations. Here in the first body paragraph, sorry, there's a couple things worth considering. My personal favorite, though, really stands out linguistically, okay? I want to really harp on that today. He's talking about Schwarzenegger, Stallone. He starts out by taking Die Hard and saying, it's really not like other action movies of the day. And he's right. And again, I don't know how familiar some of you are with the genre. Probably not as familiar as I am, because I grew up with this. I grew up on Jean-Claude Van Damme. which is strange, but I'm a big fan. Anyway, he says, these other movies, so not Die Hard, they looked like a bodybuilder's fever dream. And then he goes on to describe that in some fun detail. The sort of thing he, meaning the bodybuilder, might imagine after doing a mountain of blow and watching nothing but early MTV for 48 hours. So it's a bodybuilder, drug-fueled party type of thing. That's really interesting. And again, what I just gave you was a paraphrase, right? So I gave you the idea of it. And there's still some interesting things there, but what do we miss when I take the language away, when I'm not using the language? Bodybuilder's fever dream, and some of you may not be quite clear on what a fever dream is. We're going to talk about it. You could potentially talk about a mountain of blow. That's fun. And look, there's no good way, like what if I said, and doing a lot of cocaine? Is that the same thing connotatively as a mountain of blow? No. You lose something. Okay. Let's start with fever dream. A fever dream is exactly what it sounds like. I assume we all know what a fever is, okay? Think about the last time you had one. It may have been a while for some of us, you know, but you can usually remember it's not great, you know, and you just feel like crap. You just feel like complete crap. Even if you don't really have any other symptoms, if you just have a fever, it will crush you, right? It's a real thing. A fever dream is your fever is so high, you're suffering so badly that you hallucinate. Okay? That's what a fever dream is. So he's describing the movies that Die Hard is not as that for a bodybuilder. Whatever sort of person would commit their life to just working out. That's all they do. I know some of you like maybe go to the gym. This is way more than that, okay? To just do that. And then what that person would hallucinate when their brain is like way too hot and they've done a bunch of drugs and watched MTV and all this stuff. What is he getting at with that? Something to do with hallucination, right? Something to do, like what, I suppose I would ask, what is a hallucination? You're seeing things that aren't there. You're seeing things that aren't real. What then is he saying about these movies? They're not real. Again, granted, there are some aspects of Die Hard that are not terribly realistic, but, you know, for the most part, a good 85% of the movie, something like that, it's pretty realistic. Could happen, you know, type of thing. Not so in these other films. Early Schwarzenegger, early Sylvester Stallone. So, is that all he's saying? I don't think so. Again, because we kind of get that with the paraphrase, that they're not realistic and Die Hard is. A bodybuilder's fever dream is this insane hyperbole. So he's not just communicating that they're not realistic then, he's communicating that they're supremely over the top. They're not subtle. I don't think anyone would say that those films are subtle. But that they also sort of revel in it. The idea of a mountain of blow, again, using the slang terminology for cocaine, not even saying coke, right? Saying blow. And a mountain of it at that. It's all drowned. This whole sentence is like drenched in hyperbole. It's super over the top, perhaps in the way that those films are. But again, it's, if this is even possible, Breihan's statement is overt in its hyperbole, if that makes sense. And as such, I think he's not just saying the films are not realistic. He's saying that they don't try to be. They try to be this other insane depiction of what? Bodybuilders, and again, in the context of kind of how we're discussing Die Hard, we're talking about masculinity all of a sudden, right? Sort of old school traditional masculinity in that idea that a man's physicality truly matters, but updated for the 80s, right? Because bodybuilders are actually, at least at this time, a fairly recent development. So you have this hyperbolic depiction of a bastardized contemporary masculinity that's all juiced up. That means steroids. which he also references. It's all juiced up. It's all super over the top and shiny and all like plastic and weird. And that's kind of what Die Hard shows up and critiques, is his point. We got to all of those ideas. I know I say this all the time. By thinking about language. You got to think about language. I have one more example of this, and then we'll actually talk about paraphrase. So in the second paragraph, there at the end, again, we say a lot of fun things about McClane. We call him an asshole several times, which I don't think we ever use that language in class, but he's kind of an asshole, right? Especially, like, think about when he first sits in the limo with Argyle, and, like, Argyle's just trying to talk to him, just trying to be a nice guy. Like, there's a couple ways to describe McClane, and yeah, maybe he's got stuff on his mind, but he's acting like an asshole. So that's fair. But the last sentence here in the second paragraph, sorry. But fortunately for McClane, before he has a chance to make more of an ass out of himself. Oh, so the context, he's just finished talking about Holly. He's definitely an asshole in that moment. He even knows it, right? So before McClane has a chance to make more of an ass out of himself, some terrorists show up, and all of a sudden, he's his best self. That's really interesting. I don't know if we would quote those two full sentences, again, because think about the language we don't need. But fortunately for McClane, nothing there. Before he has a chance to, we could say that's language we have available to us, right? That's not worth quoting. Make more of an ass out of himself. That's kind of interesting, especially the ass bit, right? Ooh, bad words. So maybe we think about that. Some terrorists show up. Again, that's not language we really need, yeah? And all of a sudden, he, meaning McClane, he's his best self. Best self is interesting, especially because we've just spent this entire paragraph calling him an asshole multiple times. So two things. One, making an ass out of himself. I can hear my son. I don't know if you can. Anyway, he said he'd be quiet. He's doing all right. Making an ass out of himself. That's not the same thing as an asshole. An asshole, again, is what McClane does early in the film. Talking to the guy on the plane who's just trying to help him. He's kind of a dick, right? The fist with your toes guy, McClane is like not super nice to him when that guy is really just trying to do him a solid. Same thing with Argyle initially. Absolutely with Holly, right? So, you know, again, early, and again, it's all because he's uncomfortable and, you know, but still, he's an asshole about it. That's not what this means. To make an ass out of yourself, it could be related to that, but Breihan is kind of saying that McClane, what, like, he's a jackass, right? Like, asshole has a connotation of being a jerk, like of being mean. Making an ass out of yourself is like you're embarrassing yourself. And again, the two can be related, but it's interesting that he changes it here. He's called him an asshole the whole time, and then here at the end, he says McClane makes an ass out of himself. Does he? I think in the Holly situation, for sure. The other ones, you know, maybe not. I don't think he cares. But in the Holly situation, like, he screws up. It may be another way to put it. I think that's what we're insinuating here. But again, that's paraphrase. What does the language offer us? It's not just screwing up. You make an ass of yourself. You're screwing up in this super obvious, super avoidable way, right? Because mistakes happen, you know, that's whatever. But to make an ass of yourself, that's when you feel it, right? Isn't that really what that language means? You understand immediately, oh my God, I can't believe I did that, right? We get that with the language, again. We paraphrase that when you say, oh, McClane messes up. We lose that. So it's not just the fact that he screws up. It's that he screws up mightily, and he knows it as he's doing it. He knows this isn't the thing that should happen. He knows he could do something else, or should, or whatever, but he doesn't. He makes an ass out of it. So it's like you do an embarrassing thing, and people are embarrassed for you, but you're also embarrassed for yourself. Like, everyone understands the stupid thing you have done. Okay. The other bit of language, all of a sudden, McClane is his best self. This is when the terrorists show up. Well, let's think about that. First 30 minutes of the film, give or take, McClane isn't awesome. He doesn't come off great. And yeah, as soon as there's some gunshots, what does he do? He runs out of Holly's office, barefoot, we find out pretty quick. But like, he's immediately in his element, if you're familiar with that phrase. That's kind of what best self means here. It's like, one way to think of it, I think. And again, we're considering this language. This is what drives the conversation I'm about to have at you. He's deeply uncomfortable in the first 30 minutes of the film. He doesn't like to fly. He doesn't like Holly's job. He doesn't even seem to like the building. He doesn't like the limo. But when I say doesn't like I mean uncomfortable. He's scared of the plane. He sits up front in the limo because sitting in the back would make him feel weird. He doesn't like the computer thing. Like, he doesn't trust it at Holly's job when he gets there, right? He's like, what is this weird? It's like your grandparents with a new phone. They're like, how do you, like, again, you're uncomfortable with the thing you don't know, you don't understand. But all of this discomfort he's experiencing leads to him making an ass of himself, right? So the flip side of that is, as soon as bullets literally start flying, he's in his element. He knows this. He knows how to do this. He's trained for this. He's been a New York City cop for 11 years. Is that what he says? Something like that. He can do this. He can make this work. And more than that, if we look at the language again, his best self. It's not just that he's comfortable now. According to Breihan, this is where he belongs. This is what he should be doing. We push on that a little bit. That suggests all the other life stuff, just, walking around, being a dad. My kids have soccer practice tonight. You know what I'm saying? That stuff. He can do it, kind of. Although what we've seen of his human interaction isn't awesome. So maybe he's just not great at it. Because again, he's not, and this is the part where we would have to kind of offer our own analysis. What is it like? He's not built for it. He's not designed for it. The kind of masculinity he represents isn't overly concerned. Or again, I would go harder in the paint. I would say he's just not capable, maybe. Is that fair? I'm asking. And again, this would be the part in class where I would elicit your opinion. I'd like to know. But the reason that really interests me, all I keep thinking about, I keep coming back to how we talked about his conversation with Holly, when he recognizes that he has, quote, made an ass out of himself, right? He sees it. He sees that he shouldn't be doing these things. And that, to me, the only argument that's available is that he can't help it, right? Well, then the question becomes why? Why can't he help it? There's probably a couple answers. One of the easier ones to me is, again, the kind of masculinity, sorry about that again, the kind of masculinity he represents, the kind of masculinity he exhibits, his worldview, if you like. You can't just change that. You can't just turn that on or off. That goes for all of us, whatever your worldview might be. People can change their minds, change their opinions, but it takes time. It takes real effort, usually. And in this case, he comes out to California wanting to do those things, but wanting to isn't enough, right? It takes some time. On the flip side, he can shoot people all day. He can take down bad guys. He can kind of trade insults with Hans over the walkie-talkie. Like, he can do all that stuff. So the kind of masculinity then, I think, if we were using this in a body paragraph, McClane represents, on the one hand, maybe in a body paragraph before this, we're talking about the scene with Holly, right? And how we talked about that in class. Then on the other, it's almost like, it's not as if, because I'm always in the back of my mind thinking about, some of you always want to talk about toxic masculinity, and it's just so overly simplified. It's the idea that like all masculinity is toxic, the way that some of you guys will talk about it. That's not what Breihan is saying. I don't think that's what the film is saying. Case in point, imagine this movie without McClane. It'd be shorter. and all those people would be dead. So the film suggests that a guy like this is far from perfect or even adequate in human society in the way that we've begun to build it in 1988, right? The world is kind of leaving him behind in some ways, and that's his big internal struggle. But there are still, now granted, few and far between. There's not a lot of hostage situations in our daily lives, hopefully. But there's still some situations, there's still some moments when, yeah, maybe you do need a guy like that and who has some of the sort of old school worldview that'll get him into trouble in a lot of other cases. But when you need to shoot people in the face, guys like that are helpful, right? He's his best self, according to Breihan. Okay, let's talk about paraphrase. There's a lot of quotable language in this article. It's part of the reason I give it to you guys. But there's also some cool ideas in here. We use the phrase, the everyman appeal of Willis, a couple paragraphs later. They're on the second page. I just want to highlight that for you. I know we talked about everyman a little bit, but it might help you think, if you're not quite clear on what that phrase means, it might help you a little bit to look back at that paragraph. All right, but let's talk about paraphrase. We're a little ways down the second page. It's the paragraph that begins, of course, most of those hijackers. So it's like pretty much halfway down the second page, I suppose. At least I hope your formatting is the same as mine. I didn't think about that. Anyway, the paragraph beginning, of course, most of those hijackers are stock characters. Lead henchman Carl with his towering physique and flaxen hair. Flaxen is just kind of a fancy word for super blonde. Like so blonde it's almost white, you know? And flaxen hair looks more like an 80s action movie character than anyone else in the movie. That's true, first of all. Carl, and all the other henchmen, but Carl especially, he's the only one whose name I remember, right? He also gets the most screen time of all the henchmen. But he's the 80s villain. Hans, much like McClane, is pretty different from other 80s action, villains. Carl makes more sense in this movie at this time. Why is that? Well, first of all, again, I'm going to talk to you about paraphrase. Looking back at this first sentence, it's a longer sentence, probably because we have a semicolon in the middle of it. Most of those hijackers are stock characters. This language isn't awesome. It may, sometimes I think you guys might get tricked because this is language you're not familiar with. Stock character. All that means, it's like a stock car. Just from the factory parts is what that means. And again, the hijackers are weird because, anyway, the terrorists, yeah, they're just dudes with guns who run around going, get the guy with the ba. Yeah, they're not even people, right? They're stock characters. And that's true, but that language doesn't really help us other than just pointing that out. Again, if we quoted this, we wouldn't be quoting, my wife is texting me. Oh my God, sorry. Sorry. If we quoted this, we wouldn't be quoting for language here. We'd be quoting for the idea, which is why we could paraphrase it, and we will in a moment. After that, lead henchman Carl, so we've identified the guy we want to talk about, with his towering physique. Again, that language is kind of nice, but what are we really saying? He's big. He's real fucking big. And he is. He is that. And flaxen hair looks more, he kind of looks like the bad guy from Ghostbusters 2. That's a very old movie, but if you've ever seen it, he kind of looks like that. He's very Nordic. He looks like a Viking. Or like, he's probably got some Viking in his tree somewhere. Looks more like an 80s action movie character than anyone else in the movie. Now that last idea, and I say idea, not language, could be worth us thinking about. What does Breihan mean by he looks more like an 80s action movie character than anyone else in the movie? But again, none of that is us thinking about the language. You can pull from articles for information, for ideas, but if you're only doing that, He's so not being quiet now. If you're only doing that, then it's not worth quoting. Okay. So in this particular case, what are we interested in? How do we paraphrase it? As Breihan points out, because you want to, attribute your sources. As Breihan points out, the henchmen are largely faceless, typical characters, or characters typical to the genre. Carl, in particular, due to his size and clear Nordic background, stands as perhaps the most typical of the 80s action movie genre, something like that. I kind of did that on the fly, but the point is, we've kind of quoted his idea here by paraphrasing, and it's shorter. When you quote, usually, I'll go ahead and say every time, it's going to be longer than a paraphrase, because a paraphrase is going to force you to just pick out the information you want. So it's very similar to quoting, but it works in an opposite way. Why do I make this huge point? Well, again, the way you guys mess up when you try to work with a quotation, it's two things. Either, number one, you pull a quotation and it's a good quotation, like there's cool language and all this stuff going on, and then you just don't work with any of the language. Like, for instance, I could easily see somebody trying to talk to me about a bodybuilder's fever dream. You know, you could quote that, especially because I pointed it out. You guys love to do that. And you have that quotation, and then you would talk about, I don't know, McLean's masculinity or something like that, and never really even imply that we're working with any of the language in that quotation. Basically, what you do is you pull a quotation that's probably related to whatever you're talking about, but then you just go ahead and talk whatever you were going to talk about anyway. You don't actually touch upon the quotation. It just kind of sits there. That's mistake number one. Mistake number two is you pull a quotation for information. So in this case, that would be the last one we looked at. Let's say you quoted Breihan, you said, lead henchman Carl with his towering physique and flaxen hair, and then the rest of that about looking more like an 80s action guy. There's not really anything linguistically to dig into there. I mean, again, some of it maybe sounds a little fancier than how you write, because he's using words you guys don't use, but they're just synonyms. Flaxen means blonde, towering means huge. There's not much else going on. And I'm not saying there has to be for him. My point is, for our purposes, you have to try to find quotations that are actually worth quoting. Sometimes you can pull material for information. Again, in our case, you still want to make sure it's an argument. He's making an argument here. The issue is there's just nothing interesting linguistically. So if you were to quote this, now you would kind of end up doing the same thing. Like you would say whatever you were going to say anyway and just not deal with this quotation about Carl. The reason you're doing it here, though, is because there really isn't anything to deal with. And your brain just kind of throws up its hands. It's like, I don't know what to do with that. So you don't. So again, the trick, the order of operations here. Number one, when you quote for language. I'm not saying you're going to get it right every time, but I am saying I think some of you out there don't even really try. If I'm just being honest with you. I think you just kind of pull stuff, that's probably fine. Sometimes it is, other times it's not. Try here. Think about when we say you're quoting for language, you're looking for something that is significant. Bodybuilder's fever dream says more than it says on the page, okay? It means a thing, but there's more ideas packed into it. That's what we mean when we say you quote from language. Same thing with McLean makes an ass out of himself. All of a sudden, he's his best self. I talked to you for several minutes about what that best self means, right? And what ideas might be related to it. That's what we're looking for when we quote from language. Otherwise, you can paraphrase. And again, to be clear, most of your evidence should be quotations. Or to actually be even clearer, this is a film, and we haven't talked about it today because this is all words. But in the film itself, it's visual, so you can talk about how someone is dressed or how a scene breaks down in a particular moment or whatever. So you can't quote those. But it still works kind of the same way. Like now you're saying, well, the way McClane is dressed is significant because he's walking around in a wife beater with no shoes. Like he very clearly does not fit into this corporate world, but who does? Well, Hans does. And all of a sudden now we've used significant details, not quotations in this case, but visual details to get into the discussion of an idea. What does Hans represent? What does McClane represent? And now we're rolling. It all comes down to details. It all comes down to focusing upon specific information, whether it's from a quotation or whether it's from some visual aspect. The music, we didn't even talk about the music. Well, I talked about it in the video, but I don't know how many of you watched that. The music is pretty important in the movie. So any of these things are on the table. But again, the trick is to be specific pretty much all the time. All right, I can hear my son destroying something, so I'm gonna go deal with that. Otherwise, I hope everyone is well. We'll see each other on Thursday. I'm gonna talk to you about the revision. I'm not sure how or when. I'm gonna figure something out. I want us pretty squarely focused on this paper for now. But yeah, anyway, if you have questions about the revision, about the paper we're working on now, any and all of the above, feel free to hit me up. Otherwise, I'll see you in a couple days. Thanks, guys.